Hi everyone, this is Miss Simmons, and I wanted to make a movie to talk about the differences between Virginia and the Chesapeake, as well as the New England colonies. This is in case you missed class, and it's really to kind of help enumerate what you've been reading about in the colonial period in chapter 2 and also in chapter 3 of your textbook. We ultimately are going to be using this information to write both a short answer and also a document-based question. So it's important for you to understand this as kind of background and context before you start looking at documents and analyzing them for those writing assignments. So let's get started. So the first thing that I want to point out is the areas that we're comparing are British colonies. The Chesapeake, you guys are familiar with because you live in the Chesapeake region in Maryland, but the Chesapeake really starts with the founding of Jamestown in 1607, and this is the first permanent British set of colonies. First Virginia and then Maryland, both of those count as Chesapeake colonies. The other major set of colonies we're going to be looking at are in New England. And when we look at New England, this is really what we're looking at right here. We're talking about what is today Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut. All of this is going to start to be settled in 1620, and it will continue to grow throughout the 1600s up through the 1700s. Both of these areas are founded in roughly the same time period. We're talking about the first half of the 1600s. They're both founded by British people. They're both on the east coast of what will become the United States, but there's a lot of differences between these areas, and that's what we want to start to examine. So with Virginia, Virginia is founded by the Virginia Company. It is a profit-seeking venture where you have a couple of really wealthy people who create a joint stock company, and they create with that joint stock company they pool their resources to be able to try to make more profit by wanting to establish some sort of colony in the Americas. They assume that they can get lots of money by going and establishing a colony. And the reason that they believe this is because they're witnessing how much gold and silver, especially the Spanish, are getting out of the Americas. One of the ways that they tried to entice people to go and colonize in the Americas was to offer them the same rights as Englishmen back in England. And so they want to make sure that the people know going over they're going to be treated as equals. The area where they first land is in the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay going up the James River, and it's right here, Jamestown. One of the major reasons why they do this is because they're traveling by boat. They want access possibly to fish, but problems with this area are going to be potentially flooding. And also in many places around them, you can see on this map, these red triangles, they're surrounded by local Amerindian groups, which in this case are the Powhatan, which are a group of Algonquian people. Here is an illustration that's actually from one of the founders of Jamestown's books when he goes back to England and tries to capitalize on his experiences there by publishing different books about it. That would be John Smith. So this is published in his book, and what he illustrated here was the fort of Jamestown. And if you notice looking around it, they really are trying to protect themselves from the local people. This is Powhatan right here. This shows those first 3 boats that go over to Jamestown and the village that they originally established. Jamestown is not a great place to be when it's first founded. Many of the people who go refuse to do any work other than looking for gold or silver, and so a lot of people are going to starve. They have an incredibly high mortality rate. And you can see specifically from just these numbers between 1607 and by the time we get to 1624, you have about over a 90% death rate here happening in the area. And children who managed to live beyond the age of 5, that only made up 20% of all children born in this time period. Because of this death rate, it's sometimes called the starving time. And there's even evidence that they practice cannibalism because of the lack of food. They're also going to start stealing food from the local Amerindians, specifically the Powhatan. When we look back and see how many people from England were migrating to the Americas, there's a lot, about 189,000 people between the years of 1610 and 1660. The vast majority of those are going to the West Indies to grow sugar and to make profit off of that. The next largest group are going to the Chesapeake, they're going to Virginia, they're going to Maryland, again, to try to make profit. There's a smaller group, but significant group going to New England, and just the island of Bermuda alone, again, trying to grow for-profit crops. You've got 4,000 people just going there. There's a lot of problems also, not just with lack of food because people are unwilling to engage in agriculture. There's also problems with the local Amerindians. And there's a series of wars that are going to be happening between 1610 and 1646. In that time period, you're going to see multiple wars between the British and the Amerindians. Largely, these wars are happening because the British are raiding villages, they're burning houses, they're burning cornfields, they're stealing supplies, and the Amerindians are going to respond. The biggest response is going to be in 1622 when they go and attack the British in those regions, and they kill 347 people, including John Rolfe, which is interesting because John Rolfe is actually the person who in 1614 is married off to Pocahontas to try to create a political marriage of peace. And that marriage did create some peace for a period of time, but ultimately he's even going to be killed by Amerindians, by the Powhatan people themselves, because of this acrimonious relationship, which is a mild way of putting how much these groups are not getting along. Because of this attack in 1622, the Virginia Company will call for a perpetual war against Native Americans, and after that, Virginia will be taken over by the British government and become a royal colony. So at that point in time, the Virginia Company no longer controls Jamestown in that area. It's now going to become a royal colony, which means that the king is in charge and Parliament has to look over what's happening there. This is a depiction by the British of what happened in that Powhatan uprising of 1622. And again, you can see the brutality that's happening in killing off many of those British settlers. This does not depict or acknowledge the brutality that the English settlers had done to the Powhatan people themselves prior to this and after. Ultimately, in 1646, a peace treaty is going to come into play, which will formally remove the Powhatan, push them off their own original land. And this firmly establishes for the British this policy of exclusion. We are excluding Amerindians. We are pushing them off the land. We are taking over their land. Between the starving time and between this culture clash and these wars that are happening, you might wonder, why in the world didn't Great Britain just abandon Jamestown and forget about it? Well, during that small peaceful time, Pocahontas is going to introduce to John Rolfe how to grow tobacco. And tobacco is what really makes this colony profitable and worthwhile for first the Virginia Company and then the government of Great Britain to keep Virginia going. Tobacco is going to become so profitable that John Rolfe claims that, hey, we didn't find gold and silver lying on the ground, but this tobacco will be our gold and silver. We're going to see a massive increase, an exponential increase in the growth of tobacco over just this 11-year period of time. We go between 20,000 pounds of tobacco being grown to 1.5 million pounds of tobacco being grown. And Virginia becomes really the center of tobacco around the world. In Europe, that's getting exposed to this tobacco are becoming more addicted and want this tobacco. And so they're willing to buy it. At the same time, though, that we're overproducing tobacco, the prices are going to precipitously drop, largely because that supply continues to grow. The demand is growing a little bit, but it's not keeping up with the amount of supply of tobacco that's being grown. In the early part of the 17th century, the 1600s, we've got indentured servants who are doing the vast majority of labor in growing this tobacco. Indentured servants are poor people, perhaps people in debt in England, who want either a way out of their debt or they want a way to get land and land ownership, because land ownership meant wealth. So they would sign off on an indentured servitude contract. That particular contract and makes it so that they have to serve for 7 years without being paid. At the end of those 7 years, they would get their freedom dues, and those freedom dues would include land. That's the big thing that they're going over to Virginia to do. This whole system is sometimes called the head right system, because for people who are wealthy enough to pay for indentured servants to go over to the Americas, they would get a certain amount of land dependent on how many people they brought over to grow tobacco. So for every head that they bring over, they have the right of more land. And they're supposed to give that land to these indentured servants after those 7 years of servitude, but depending on the contract, they wouldn't necessarily have to give all the land that they had been given for those individual people. Virginia is going to really see some negative side effects of really focusing in on tobacco. One of them is that tobacco is a really nutrient demanding crop. It is going to ruin the soil, and that's going to help push manifest destiny from the very inception of the British colonies. Because as the land lost its nutrients and you have people that want to continue to grow tobacco, they're going to search for further land west to continue that growth of tobacco. It's going to chain Virginia's economy to a single crop, which is disadvantageous if there's a flood or a drought or some sort of insect infestation that could be destroying the tobacco. Because then if the crops are destroyed, then all profits for that particular year are destroyed. However, despite that negative impact, it still will make Virginia a viable place to be. The biggest negative impact that is going to emerge from this is as plantations are developed to grow tobacco, this really increases the belief that they need some sort of abundant, cheap labor source. At first, this is indentured servitude, and it is going to evolve into slavery. And when you guys watching slavery in the making of America, you're going to see that development happen over the 1600s. With these plantations, what we're going to see is a spread of plantations along major waterways. There are very few towns that are developing here, schools. We just have really a rural area of a lot of plantations that are spread out along major waterways. Your closest neighbor would probably be more than 5 miles away, and large plantations would be over 100 acres. If you were a poorer person or a indentured servant who managed to get your freedom dues, you probably had somewhere between 50 and 100 acres. This is going to cause problems as well in terms of people interacting with each other and being maybe a little bit more isolated. Africans are going to first arrive in Jamestown in 1619. The first Africans that arrive are likely treated as indentured servants. Why do we believe this? Because there are no codified laws about slaves at that point in time. We really don't see the very first laws about slavery until the 1660s. So for decades, probably the Africans that are there are treated as indentured servants. As you guys watch again Slavery in the Making of America, you're going to see that evolution starting to happen in the 1640s, where we see more of a labor system, instead of being based on indentured servitude, being based on race. The population of the Chesapeake, we're going to see the British population increasing, but also the people of African descent increasing, not at the same rate, but definitely over the 1600s. This also gives us further evidence of how much slavery doesn't become a major thing until we really start to see the 1680s and beyond. Slaves are coming over to the Americas via what was known at the time as the Middle Passage, which is an incredibly brutal system of the Atlantic slave trade where people are bought, stolen from the west coast of Africa and brought mostly to Brazil and to the Caribbean, but they're also being taken to other places as well. The vast majority of slaves that make it into the British colonies are coming directly from the Caribbean as opposed to coming from Africa and the Western African countries and areas of Western Africa. Colonial slavery becomes harsher and harsher as time goes on. We're going to see that by the end of the 1600s, we have many slave codes in place, which make it such that if you were of African descent, you were determined to be a slave for life, and the status of your mother is what really determined your status. If your mother was a slave, then you were going to be a slave for life. This really encouraged the raping of female slaves by their masters, because masters knew that they could create more slaves, and even though they were a biological parent to that child, they didn't treat that child at all as if they were their own. They treated them as nothing more than property. And that will continue and be part of our system of racism that's developing within the United States and clearly still exists today. One thing that is different about the British colonies and the Spanish colonies, many Spaniards believed that if Native Americans, who they were forcing into labor, converted to Christianity, then they could not be enslaved. This does not apply in the British colonies. In the British colonies, what we're seeing is even if people of African descent converted to Christianity, this doesn't change their status as slave. Population in the Chesapeake between 1610 and 1750. Over this period of time, what we're really seeing is a largest increase of people from England and from other places in Europe. The Native American population is waning, and the African American population is also growing. But note again, when does it really start to pick up? Beginning of the 1700s. 1619 is not only a really pivotal year because it's the first year that we see people of African descent coming into the Chesapeake, but it's also a pivotal year because it is the year that the House of Burgesses is established. When the House of Burgesses is established, this essentially is a political governing body of Virginia in which the king grants to the people of Virginia some rights themselves. They have the right, for instance, to initiate legislation. They have the right to control their own finances and to raise a military and to go out and protect themselves against Amerindian attack. They had a council that's like the upper house of the House of Burgesses that's appointed by the governor himself. And then they had essentially a House of Commons, which is the lower house where you would have local people voting and electing those people to represent them. When Virginia becomes a royal colony, the king at the time, who's James I, decides that he really does not like Virginia. He dislikes tobacco. And so he's going to revoke the charter of the Virginia Company and give that area direct control of him. So by him, so he can control exactly what's going on there. The last major thing that I want to talk about with Virginia is a rebellion that takes place in 1676, and that's Bacon's Rebellion. This is an important rebellion to know about because it tells us a lot of things about the establishment of the colony, the future of the colony, and also kind of the divisions that existed in all colonial regions. So background information on Nathaniel Bacon. Nathaniel Bacon, fashion forward, Nathaniel Bacon is a really wealthy man. He comes to Virginia and he's there later than a lot of the other original wealthy planters. So the land that he gets is further in the west. It is not in the eastern part along those major rivers. He is surrounded by a lot of former indentured servants who had also gotten their freedom dues, and the land that they had gotten is less desirable land. They're essentially acting as a buffer zone between Amerindians, the Powhatan, and the people in the established East. Nathaniel Bacon paid taxes like everyone else to the government of Virginia, and he felt very strongly that even though he paid taxes, the government of Virginia did very little to protect him and his neighbors from attack by the Powhatan. And so he starts to complain, and he comes up with a manifesto of why he wants to destroy the government of Virginia. He pulls together an army of people. Most of these people are former indentured servants. They're poor. They're also feeling like they pay high taxes, but the government isn't there to protect them. He gets his army together and he marches to Jamestown, manages to burn down Jamestown. The governor escapes with his life, goes up to Maryland for a period of time. Nathaniel Bacon drinks something that has some terrible bacteria in it, gets dysentery, which is essentially diarrhea, dies of dehydration because of that. The army kind of falls apart and they move back west. So Bacon's rebellion ultimately fails. Why is this an important rebellion then? One of the reasons why it's an important rebellion is because what it's really illustrating is a real divide, not between the North and the South, which we typically think of when we think of American history, but a divide between the East and the West. The people in the East tend to be wealthier, they tend to be elite, they tend to be established. The people in the West tend to be poor people who are kind of subsistence people. They may not have the same education. They might be living paycheck to paycheck, if you will, before paychecks actually existed. They're living year to year, crop to crop. And they feel like the elites in the East who are wealthier really don't have their interests at heart. This divide, I would argue, still exists today, not so much between East and West, but between kind of the coast of the United States and Middle America. Another reason why this rebellion is so important is that the wealthy people in the East are now viewing these former indentured servants as a real possible threat. And so they don't want to continue to have indentured servants that are going to potentially rise up and rebel if they feel like their rights are not being looked after. And so Bacon's rebellion, not coincidentally happening in the late 1670s, will ultimately help lead to more of a reliance on slavery because people are fearful of what indentured servants might do. Briefly, I want to talk about Maryland. Maryland also being part of the Chesapeake. The very first colony in our colonial establishment in Maryland is St. Mary's. You guys may have gone there in fourth grade. St. Mary's is founded in 1634, and it's going to expand from there. Similar to Virginia, most of the people living in the colony of Maryland grew tobacco, and so that tobacco is going to expand. One thing that's very different about Maryland, though, is that it's founded by a noble family that happens to be Catholic. And because they're Catholic, they're founded by the Calverts, he's a noble. His title is Lord Baltimore, but his real last name is Calvert. He is going to offer safe haven to all Catholics in Maryland. The majority of people going to Maryland were Anglican, but Maryland had the highest number of Catholics anywhere. And so this is one of the first examples of some sort of religious toleration in the colonies. So that's our Chesapeake. Let's now talk a little bit about Massachusetts. How does it compare to the Chesapeake colonies? So Virginia was founded in 1607. This should have a 0 there and it's not showing. The Mayflower is founded in Mayflower set sail for originally Virginia gets put off course and ends up in Massachusetts in 1620. So this should be the year 1620. There we go. The Mayflower is going to be filled with a group of people known as the Puritans. There are also people called separatists. Religiously speaking, these are people who don't agree with the Church of England. They're all Protestant Christians, meaning that they're not Catholic, but they have different interpretations of the Bible. Puritans very strongly, and separatists, believed in something called predestination, which means that they believe that God knows everything, and since God knows everything, he already knows who's going to make it into heaven when you die and who isn't. So it's been predetermined who the saved people are. Puritans believe that they're part of that group of people. They call themselves the elect. Separatists are like even more extreme Puritans. And because they didn't like the way that the Anglican Church was being run in England, they wanted to separate themselves from the Church of England and from England. They wanted to purify the Church of England, because they felt that it was corrupt. And they wanted to create a separate community for themselves. They first tried to establish this in Europe. That fails, and they end up getting the ability to establish a colony in the Americas. That colony is supposed to be in Virginia, but as I said, when they travel in 1620, they get blown off course and end up in Massachusetts. When they land, they want to establish what's known as a city on a hill, an example to the rest of the world. So if you imagine a city on a hill, a beacon of light to the rest of the world, they expect people to look up to them, to look to them as an example of perfection and how to live a good Christian life. Because they expect everyone to be living that perfect Christian life, the way that they live is incredibly simply. They don't like a lot of ornate jewelry. They don't like a lot of ornate clothes. They don't like people amassing massive amounts of wealth, because they feel like that's not really the purpose of Christianity. They also want people to adhere to their laws and their strict way of life. When they land in November of 1620, before leaving the boat, they sign off on something called the Mayflower Compact, which is kind of a rudimentary form of government, which basically gives them the right to govern themselves while still listening to the king. And this is going to create a different kind of political scenario than what we're going to see in a lot of other places. It's signed before, as I said, before they leave the ship. It's not a constitution, but it's an agreement to form a government and to submit to what the majority of people want. This led to, in Massachusetts, more and more settlers meeting in local assemblies to make their own laws. They believe in having a social covenant, which is like a sacred contract between people. That meant that they were all going to be looking out for each other. So if someone's spouse died and you needed help with watching the children or with food, then certainly your neighbors in that social contract or that social covenant were going to be there for each other. But it also meant that you were spying on your neighbors and making sure that they were all living up to the expectations of their church. There was very little privacy and very little toleration for people who had different ideas. They lived in a much closer, tight-knit community. Remember those plantations that were about 5 miles or more apart in the Chesapeake? In New England, what we're really seeing are villages that have small towns very close to each other. And you would have much smaller tracts of land. This isn't 100 acres. This is maybe a half of an acre that you see here, maybe even less than that, that you would have connected to your specific house. We are going to see over the period of the 1620s and especially the 1630s, as civil war is happening in England, that more and more people who are Puritans are trying to escape England and go to New England, and specifically this Puritan community. That is our first great migration in American history. We have in total 70,000 Puritans that are coming over in that decade alone, and about 20,000 people who weren't Puritans coming over. This is a further depiction of how land is divided. So I'm just going to point out a couple of things. You would have a common field, and I don't know if you've ever been to Boston, but in Boston, there are the common grounds where you can walk around that's open to everyone. You have plots of land that are divided amongst different people's houses, but you also had general fields where people could bring their animals to graze. So there's a lot of sharing that's going on here that you would not find in the Chesapeake. They also have a law that states that for every town of 40 or more people, you have to have a school. That's not something that existed in the Chesapeake or in the South. What we are going to see in Massachusetts is that the mortality rate is nowhere near as high as it is in the Chesapeake. The average life expectancy is about 70 years. You have a lot of extended families. On average, people had about 6 kids per family, and people are waiting until their 20s to get married. But they are really, it's much more of a family-based community. And whereas the Chesapeake, you see a lot of single people coming over, in Massachusetts, you're seeing a lot of families that are coming over. This is going to spread throughout this entire New England region. And you're going to see this spread also, just as a comparison, in the Chesapeake to New England, those communities spreading. One of the original leaders in New England is a guy named John Winthrop. He's the person who coins the phrase, "We shall be as a city on a hill." He really wants to promote the idea of New England. Its purpose is being a Puritan example to the rest of the world. The population of New England is going to be higher than, not higher, but the life expectancy in New England is even higher than it is in England, and certainly higher than it is in the Chesapeake. Not everyone is incredibly happy with the way of life in Massachusetts, and there are 2 great examples of dissenters, Roger Williams being the first, and then Anne Hutchinson. So Roger Williams believes that essentially you should not have a real connection between religion and government. Massachusetts, essentially, at its inception, has a theocracy, which is a government based on religion. The laws that they come up with are based on their Puritan beliefs and their Puritan way of life. Roger Williams doesn't want that. He wants separation of church and state. He doesn't think that the government should be tied to a religion. Because of these ideas, he is kicked out of Massachusetts, and he establishes Rhode Island. So he is the founder of Rhode Island, and in Rhode Island, that's the very first colony where we see a strict division of church and state, and also freedom of religion. Anne Hutchinson is another dissenter. She had a different interpretation of how you got into heaven. And she had a large following of people who agreed with her. Because she was seen as a threat, as the leading people within Massachusetts, she is also going to be kicked out of Massachusetts, and she goes and takes her followers to Rhode Island. So we are going to see that in Rhode Island, you have universal manhood suffrage. This is the first time this ever exists in the British colonies. It didn't matter how rich you were. It didn't matter how poor you were. You could get the ability to vote. Later on, that's going to be restricted by property, but it's at its inception, when Roger Williams is there, he does this. He also allows, again, for freedom of religion. The Puritans in Massachusetts hate Rhode Island, and they call it the sewer because they see this as a place where anyone who didn't believe in Puritan beliefs could go. And this provides some more information specifically about Anne Hutchinson. This, by the way, all of these slides are found under notes under classroom. The last major thing that I want to talk about concerning New England is their relationship with Amerindians. There are two major groups that they interacted with, and similar to the Chesapeake, it's not a great relationship. There are wars between themselves and the Picos. The Picos, they essentially annihilate. In fact, if we look at a history of wars in American history and you look at just the devastation based on percentages, the Pequot War would be up there as the worst war we've ever been involved in, because the people of New England, again, essentially kill off all Picos in that particular war in a land grab. Here is a drawing of a Pequot War where you see all these soldiers surrounding a Pequot village, and they're coming in and attacking and killing not just the warriors, but also women, children, and the elderly as well. The other major war that takes place is Metacom's War. The British call him King Philip. He is going to unite a group of Amerindians together to try to fight against the British in New England, and his war is going to be known as King Philip's War. Ultimately, this ends up in a failure. His own family will be sold off into slavery, and he is going to be killed in a very dramatic and brutal fashion. By the end of this war, he'll be beheaded and then his body is drawn and quartered. And this permanently pushes out the Amerindians in that area. So again, at Thanksgiving, when we celebrate this positive relationship between Amerindians and the colonists, let's try to remember reality here, which is not so amicable. Overall, in all of the New England colonies, what we are going to see is that the white population between 1620 and 1750 is increasing. Native American populations are dying off from disease and warfare. And there are people of African descent that are there, but the numbers are pretty low. A lot of people assume that there were only slaves in the South. That is not true. There are slaves in literally every one of the British colonies, except for, get this irony, Georgia, because Georgia is established as a debtor's colony where they have built-in labor because they're sending over people in debt in England. That's all I've got. I will talk to you guys soon in class. Bye-bye.